Something I've noticed over the years is how many people give lip service to the Bible and to the importance of the Bible, but really don't know much about it. They say we should use it as a guide for our lives, but then they're surprised when they hear stories like the one I told last week about Jael nailing a man's head to the ground with a tent peg. There were audible gasps at both services when I got to that part of the story. The reason the Bible is so important is not because it's sugary sweet and not because it's family friendly, because it really isn't. We'd like to think it is, but it really isn't. It's important because it tells the truth about our world and it tells the truth about us. And the truth is, the majority of us, even the best among us, is flawed. So just as one example, when I talk about biblical role models for faith, I often will bring up Abraham and Sarah, right? Who were the very first ones to answer God's call and enter into a covenant relationship with God. So God promised Abraham and Sarah, if they were faithful to this covenant, if they would get up and go to the promised land that God would give to them, that he would make their descendants like the stars in the sky and like the sands on the beach, and that all the families of the earth would one day be blessed through them and through their descendants. And Abraham and Sarah accepted that challenge. They took that leap of faith. They got up and they went, even though they were already old when it happened. So they are role models for us. But we also know, because the Bible tells us, that they faltered and they failed in a pretty significant way. When Sarah didn't get pregnant right away, right, and have that first descendant, which she expected, she came up with an alternative plan of her own involving her handmaiden, Hagar. That's a part of the story we don't always focus a lot of attention on, but it's there. And the child that resulted from that union between Abraham, Sarah's husband, and Sarah's handmaiden, Hagar, his name was Ishmael. And Genesis 16 describes Ishmael like this: he shall be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall live at odds with all his kin. Now, if you want to understand why people have been fighting each other in the Middle East now for thousands of years, this is not a bad place to start. Kind of explains some things. Because the descendants of Sarah's son, Isaac, when she finally had that child that was promised, and the child of Hagar and Abraham, Ishmael, so Isaac and Ishmael, they've been at each other's throats now from the very beginning. That story's all told right there in Genesis. You might even say that we are still experiencing and dealing with the fallout from Abraham and Sarah's unfaithfulness. All these years later, the world's still dealing with that. It might sound strange to hear this said, but finding a good role model in the Bible isn't as easy as you might think. Noah got off the ark and immediately went on a drunken bender. Abraham's grandson, Jacob, was a liar and a cheat, and yet was still given the name Israel by God. He stole his brother's birthright and blessing. Moses was a murderer before making his great escape. King David committed adultery and then covered it up. But there is one character. I've been looking forward to the sermon for a while, because there's one character in the Old Testament, and he's just singular, really, in this way, that doesn't fit in that mold. And that is Jacob's son, it'd be Abraham's great-grandson, Joseph. When it comes to role models in the Bible, it doesn't really get any better than Joseph. His story is told over 14 chapters in the book of Genesis. So it's not just a story, it's an epic, it's a saga. It's such an amazing story. And in those chapters, we see how Joseph encountered every crisis, every temptation, and he did it with integrity, character, and faith. He never once stumbled. Next to Jesus, there is no one like him in the Bible. I would challenge you to find somebody, at least of that stature, whose story we know, that would fit that bill. Sometimes I describe Joseph as the original Boy Scout because he was so good. And what we learn from him is that character and faith can help us overcome just about any crisis or challenge we might encounter. There's a church consultant that I follow and have been for a couple of years now, whose name is Carey Nieuwhof. And he talks a lot about the importance of character in ministry. And one of the quotes that I often see from him is this one: competency gets you in the room, right? Having the right skills will get you the job. But he says character keeps you in the room. In other words, as a pastor, you might be a great preacher, you might be a charismatic leader, but if your character isn't where it should be, you're not going to last long. It's just not going to happen. So his advice to pastors like me is to work twice as hard on my character as I do on my skills, on my competency. And I think he's right. And not only that, I think that's true for everyone in any job. Character matters. It really does. And that's why Joseph is such a great role model. If there's anything that can be said about Joseph that paints him in a negative light, it is his kind of immaturity when he was young, his naivete, maybe. But even that, I think, gets overblown. We focus on that. We talk about that, but I think that gets overblown. So let's take a look at the beginning of his story, okay? So this is Genesis 37, the opening part of Joseph's story. Now, Israel, okay, so when it says Israel, who we're talking about there is Jacob, the name that was given to Jacob by God, loved Joseph more than any of his other children because he was the son of his old age. He was also the son of Rachel, Jacob's second wife. Remember, he married Leah first and had babies with her, but Rachel was the one he loved, so this was his first with Rachel. The fact that he was Jacob's favorite, that wasn't Joseph's fault. That was just the reality, right? And Jacob made him a long robe with sleeves, which we sometimes call the coat of many colors, right? Showed his favoritism. But when Joseph's brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Again, not his problem, not his fault. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. Even at 17, I think, Joseph probably should have known that sharing that dream with his brothers wasn't the best idea. So I'll give you that, right? He should have known that was going to cause problems for him. But that didn't excuse, and that doesn't excuse what happens next in the story, because Joseph's brothers devised a plan. Plan A was to kill him. They were ready to murder their brother because of that. But Joseph's brother Reuben wouldn't agree with that idea. And I'm trying to get 10 brothers, so there was 12 altogether. So Joseph had a younger brother, Benjamin, just so you're wondering where the 12th one is, who was younger than him. He wasn't a part of this plan, but the 10 decided that they were going to kill him. Reuben objected, and so they came up with plan B, and their plan B was to kidnap him, then sell him into slavery, and tell their father that he had been devoured by wild animals. And they did. That's what they did. They even took his robe, his coat of many colors, and showed it to Jacob and how it was bloodied and torn up, and that's what was believed. And then they sold him to some traveling Ishmaelites. Okay, there's that name again. So these were the descendants of their great-grandfather, Abraham and Hagar. And those Ishmaelites then took Joseph to Egypt, and they sold him to a rich man named Potiphar. Now, for most people, that would have been the end of the story. I really do believe that for most people, because, here he was now living in a foreign country. He was working as a slave in, it was a rich man, but he was living as a slave in this man's household. But Joseph didn't despair. And what we see is that no matter what happened to him, he always responded with optimism, with hard work, and with good character. And I believe that's what it takes to make something good out of a bad situation. That's what it took then. It's what it takes now, thousands of years later. That's still what it takes to make something good out of a bad situation. I've said to my kids for their entire lives, cream rises to the top. And what I mean by that is that when you try to do the right thing in every situation, it doesn't mean bad things won't still happen, but eventually that approach pays off. It does. People notice. Good things happen when you do that. The cream rises, and that's what happened to Joseph, even as a slave in Potiphar's house. So we read in Genesis 39. So Joseph found favor in Potiphar's sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and with him there he had no concern for anything but the food that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome and good looking. This is where the story kind of goes off the rails. And after a time, Potiphar, the master's wife, cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." Now, this is where Joseph's story gets kind of R-rated, actually. That's another thing that people sometimes forget about the Bible, that it's way sexier than a lot of people would ever imagine, that, again, give lip service to it, but don't ever read it. So you might say Potiphar's wife was the original cougar. And she was on the hunt. And Joseph was right there, and he was good looking, right? He was a handsome man, but he was also an honest one, and he turned her down, and when he did, she accused him of trying to rape her. That's what she did. And he was a slave. Even though he was really good at his job, he was still a slave, and so he was powerless against this, and so the consequences were severe, and the next thing he knew, he was in an Egyptian prison. So he goes from being a slave to being a prisoner. Sounds pretty terrible, doesn't it? But even that wasn't the end of his story. I think it would be for most people. Wasn't the end of his story, because once again, the cream rose to the top. So we read in Genesis 39, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper." So not only did Joseph wind up running the prison, he also made some really important contacts with people in the highest levels of the government, people who knew and were close to Pharaoh himself. So when Pharaoh learned that Joseph was gifted at dream interpretation, on top of everything else that he was good at, Pharaoh called on Joseph to interpret one of his dreams. And in that dream, it became apparent to Joseph, who then communicated this with Pharaoh, that Egypt was going to have 7 years of plenty, when there would be, the fields would produce and there'd be an abundance of food, but that would be then followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh was so impressed by Joseph that he brought him on board as his second in command so that Joseph could help him manage this crisis that was coming. So we read in Genesis 41. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you." So Joseph ruled alongside Pharaoh for 7 years. And he was right. Joseph was right about the dream. At the end of that 7 years, the famine arrived, just as Joseph said it would, and the world was plunged into hunger and starvation. The whole world except for Egypt, because of Joseph. And that's when the story gets really interesting. Because who should come to Egypt begging for food but those same 10 brothers that sold Joseph into slavery? And who should they come to asking for food but Joseph himself? And at first they had no idea who they were talking to. When they did finally discover the truth, which is a great story in and of itself, they were afraid, and rightly so. So we read in Genesis 50, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way, he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. Now, Joseph had every right at this point to rain down vengeance on his brothers, and he had the power to do that. He could have done whatever he wanted. But once again, Joseph made the better choice, the right choice. He forgave his brothers. He said, "What you intended for harm, God intended for good." I have a song on my favorite Spotify playlist, and the song is called "The Righteous Path." It's by a group called the Drive-By Truckers. You can check it out if you want sometime. And it talks about staying focused on doing the right thing or the righteous thing, even when it's hard, even when life is hard. And I like that song and I like that idea because I think that's something that the world is missing. A big chunk of the world is missing that. The word righteousness is often perceived in a negative way, especially when someone is self-righteous, which is not a good thing. Okay, that's a whole other sermon, but that's not a good thing. But the goal of righteousness, which is a biblical idea, is simply to do the good thing, the godly thing, the right thing in every situation. One of my favorite mottos is this one: just do the next right thing. Make that your life goal. Just keep doing that over and over again. That's what a righteous life looks like. That's what it means to love God with heart, soul, strength, and mind. That's what it means to follow Jesus in the way. That's what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. And it isn't always easy. The challenge for us is the same as it was for Joseph. How do we stay focused on the righteous path, even in the midst of life's challenges? Joseph had every reason to give up, not just once, but many times. He was betrayed by his own brothers. He was unjustly accused of crimes. He was thrown in jail. But he didn't use any of that as an excuse to embrace the dark side, which is what people do all the time. They use those things as an excuse to go down a dark, hateful path. But he didn't go there. He made the better choice. And he showed us that we can do the same. Joseph is a role model of righteousness. Probably one of the best you're ever going to see anywhere next to Jesus. If you're like me, you need a role model like that. And if you're not sure if that's something that you need, there's an easy way to figure it out. Joseph's character was revealed again and again by the challenges that he experienced in life. Carey Nieuwhof, that same church consultant that preaches character over competency, maintains that the best way to determine your state of character is to analyze the last time you responded to a crisis, right? The last time you had some kind of a crisis or adversity in your life. And it doesn't have to be something big either, right? So for instance, how did you react the last time your kids melted down in the back seat of the car, right? Or your spouse complained about some chore that you haven't done yet. Or maybe you had an idea you shared at work, and it was a good idea, but it got shot down. Or probably something we all know about. You got cut off in traffic. Somebody did something rude to you on the road. Be honest. What did you say? What did you think? What did you do in that moment? That's the true state of your character. The fact is, adversity does not build character, it reveals it. It did for Joseph, and it does for us too. Adversity reveals character. Now, of course, you're going to be tempted to convince yourself that your reactions under pressure are the exception to the rule, right? After all, you were stressed, or it happened so quickly that you didn't have time to think and you just reacted. But I want to suggest you don't let yourself off the hook. Don't let yourself off the hook. What if those moments of adversity and your response to them are a sign pointing to what God needs you to work on next? What if you didn't dismiss them, but instead saw them as a path to personal and spiritual growth? If you are humble enough and brave enough to do that, you'll probably discover what a lot of us do. And that's it. And that is the fact that you've still got a ways to go, because most of us do. In other words, welcome to the club. Welcome to the club, because not everybody can be a Boy Scout like Joseph. Most of us are going to be way more like all of those other characters in the Bible, like Abraham and Sarah and Jacob and Moses and Noah and Jonah and any of Jesus' 12 disciples. We're going to make mistakes. So when you fail, say you're sorry, learn something about yourself, and try to do better next time. I guarantee when you seek the righteous path, like Joseph, you will prosper, like Joseph. When you seek to live as a person of faith and love in a faithless and loveless world, like Cream, you too will rise.